Hey Shelly, it's David. Just wanted to check in with you, and everyone else in the Eclectic Book Club. We are getting close to finishing the Iliad. At least I am, and definitely on pace to be able to finish before the end of the month. And as a whole, I'm enjoying the process of reading the story and reading the Iliad. But I think, like at least a few others in the group, I'm finding that my enjoyment level of it is not nearly what I expected it to be going into this. It's not to say I'm disliking it by any means. I'm happy to have been going back through the Iliad. I'm enjoying the process, but it's yet to grab me and make me want to just keep reading it nonstop in the same way that other works of literature, other stories, other books have done this year. And your question earlier this week really got me to thinking about why that is. If you've missed Shelley's video, I'll have it linked for everybody else down below. But she poses the question of why read difficult literature. And I think there's a lot to unpack inside of that question. I'm going to try to be brief here, with it being the holidays. I don't want to go too overboard because I know everybody's got just a limited amount of time. But I did want to make sure that I wrestled with this question a little bit for everybody, because if you watched my massive plans for 2022, then you know I'm setting myself up to read more difficult literature in 2022. And I'm absolutely excited about it. I am the type of reader that I grew up reading almost predominantly fantasy. That was my bread and butter. I grew up on those kinds of tales, dabbled a little bit in science fiction, dabbled a bit in horror with the Goosebumps series of books. I read way too many of those growing up. But I was primarily a genre reader, and I enjoy reading genre fiction still to this day. As you can tell, I've been in very much a sci-fi mood, and that continues still yet today. To where if you were to take away everything that I'm reading with other people and tell me to go grab a book that I want to read and sit down, it would probably be a science fiction book right now, because I'm just very, very much in the mood for the genre fiction. And while there's a lot of great value in reading entertaining reads, and there's nothing wrong with people that like to stick to their genre and to read those kinds of books, this is not dismissing them in any way, shape, or form. Like, there are some great ones that wrestle with really big ideas and have really awesome layers of complexity to them that you just absolutely appreciate, and you grow as a person from encountering those, both in science fiction and fantasy. I can tell you that there are plenty of books out there that do both of those things really, really well. But they are not, in general, what I would consider to be difficult literature. When you think difficult literature, you're probably going to first think back to high school or college literature courses and the glut of books that were thrust upon you as forced reads that your enjoyment may or may not have been hampered because they were required readings for a class. And Homer, for a lot of people, probably would fit into that category of being required reads in high school or college that probably wouldn't have been picked up on their own. I know for me, I did pick them up on my own. They were not part of any of my coursework. But I'm getting a little off track here, but the value in reading difficult literature for me, and again, this is a very me-centered expression. What resonates for me, what works for me, what is meaningful to me, what I get out of it, may not be the same for everybody across all of BookTube, across all of the readership. And I understand that and I appreciate that everybody is unique in what they enjoy, what they get out of things, what they struggle with, and their willingness to really struggle with it. The philosophy and reading tag that's been going around has people considering some really interesting questions. I don't know that there's anything that I can do to add value to the questions that a dozen other booktubers on every single question have answered better than I could. So I'm probably not going to end up doing that one. Sorry, Brandon. It's a great tag, and I absolutely have enjoyed watching other people's thoughts on it. But I'd much rather do a video like this where I really expound on one of those things. And I think this kind of parallels with the one of his questions where should reading always be fun? Something along the lines of that. And reading difficult literature certainly can qualify as something that is not done as much for the fun. If you're going into something like the Iliad, expecting to get a story that has great growth in character development or long quest-like adventures that take you across lots of captivating scenes and places or anything like that, you're going to be disappointed because that's not the focus of this. In fact, so much of the story is centered around just a very small area. And we have a lot of names that get thrown around, but only a few that get a lot of time in the spotlight. And arguably, not really any that show any real character growth over the course of the tale of the Iliad, at least that I've seen so far. You get some great personal moments with characters like Hector. We're finally getting to some with Achilles towards the end, to where you can understand them a little bit more. You can sympathize perhaps with them a little bit more, but you don't really see them grow or get changed. In fact, we learn pretty late in the poem for sure, and it might have been hinted at very early on, and I just missed it, that part of the reason why Achilles has held back throughout this entire book is because of a prophecy foretelling his death. And so he's kind of stayed back. He's been that figure lurking in the shadows, that the threat of him coming into and bearing down upon the enemy army has always been there as a undertone of the story, but he hasn't actually stepped in and been taken part in the action, and that's very quickly about to change. I just read the chapter where he kind of gears up in the armor that Hephaestus forges for him. But anyway, I'm getting off track again, and the reason why reading difficult literature is something that I do, that I choose to do, and that I do enjoy doing, even when I don't necessarily absolutely enjoy the work itself, if it's not going to become an instant favorite, is because of the growth that I will undergo in the process of reading it. By grappling with things that are outside of my comfort zone, things that might require me to slow down a little bit more, to consider looking at notes and glosses and maybe even some critical essays to really grapple with what's being talked about in there and what's being alluded to. I get some, I feel like I grow as a person, as a reader, And not only that, reading Homer and some of the other works that are staples in the history of literature. Not even using the term Western canon, although that would certainly be the term that would come to mind first. By reading through those works, I'm also laying a foundation that builds upon the works along the way, to where when I encounter something being alluded to in a more modern piece than what I'm reading originally, Homer being a great example. You can look back at the stuff in the Homer and see how he's laying the groundwork for so much of what's going to come after, and catching things that are alluded to in stories. And I've used this as an example because it was one of the first things that jumped out to me when reading the Iliad. Is we've got the Telemanus being a group of people, a family in the Red Rising series. And we've got the Telamon family in the Iliad of the Ajax giant and his little brother. And all of a sudden, things make so much more sense because I'm able to connect those dots and see the reference in a book that I read earlier this year and how it points back to something and evokes a specific image, a quality, a connection that you would miss otherwise without having any framework around having read the Iliad. And that's part of what I really love about revisiting and visiting for the first time some of these more difficult pieces that form the foundation of literature for what comes later. And we see that across all kinds of different cultures and civilizations. One of the things I would love to do more is to read more older Japanese and Chinese literature going forward. So if anybody has good recommendations on either of those, I know that both of them have quite the long history of written works. And I would love to dive into more of those in 2022 if I can, or 2023 for sure. I've got Tale of the Genji that I'm going to be reading as a absolute I must read this for 2022. That's on my radar. But if there's others that I should be putting on there and you have good recommendations, please let me know in the comments or shoot me an email. Don't feel like you'll overload me. If you send me 50 titles, I will put all 50 titles onto a list of I need to eventually get to these to start forming that foundation again that I can build upon, which will deepen appreciation and understanding as I encounter other things throughout my reading. And it's the same kind of thing that I can experience with, I'm going to use two very simple examples here. I love J.R.R. Tolkien and his writings. And he was heavily influenced by a lot of things that he read and loved to read. And two of those things that I've come to appreciate myself individually that also deepen my appreciation for what he does in Tolkien's works would be Beowulf and then the Icelandic sagas. Both of those things, you can see the fingerprints of those works in Tolkien's own writing and the way he thought about things and the way he approaches certain aspects of things within The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion. And by being able to make those connections and see those reflections, it just adds layer upon layer of things that I can appreciate as I go. And sometimes when reading some of these older, more difficult texts, you find ones that become new favorites. And that is part of the wonderful aspect of reading these more challenging texts. Because then you find a new favorite, and it becomes something that you want to go back and revisit. Not only because you enjoy it, because every time you revisit it, you pick up on more things, which then deepens that foothold that it has. And so while something like the Iliad, my enjoyment is kind of middle of the road on it. It's certainly one that I'd be okay with rereading in the future, but it's not one I'm going to be rushing back to reread in the future. And, translation might have had something to do with it. I'm sure there are better translations out there for enjoyment than the Fagles translation. But that is, in a very long and roundabout way, trying to answer Shelley's question of why read difficult literature. And it's a very rewarding experience as a whole that sometimes is fraught with missteps, with things that are highly disappointing, that are deeply worth your time, and others that are you feel like you wasted away hours that you could have been reading something else. But the learning is all part of that process. And maybe for me, it makes sense to get this kind of enjoyment because I am someone who always loved learning new things. I always was excited about school. I was always happy to learn more things. I always was told that I would make a good teacher, that I had that thirst for learning and that passion for talking about it and sharing it with others. And that's probably why I ended up eventually realizing that and going back to become a teacher and at college level courses. And it's something that I hope to share that passion with students as I grow into that position and gain a better foothold on what I'm trying to accomplish and how to best go about doing that to reach today's students. So thank you for watching. This has been a long one. I won't, Shelly, I won't end with any kind of a question to you. But I am curious to hear, once you finish, your final thoughts on the Iliad. And do you think, based on what we expect, that we have the Iliad, you've got the humans on one level and you've got the gods on one plane, and you're seeing the interactions between the two and how the gods are influencing things and changing maybe some of the outcomes along the way. But with the Odyssey, I think we all are expecting it to be more of a human-centered focus for the story, uh, with Odysseus and the journey he goes upon. Are you expecting to enjoy the Odyssey more or about the same? Or is that maybe a story that's a little less suited to what you would want to see out of this kind of older work of literature? I'm curious because I think by and large, our friends in the Eclectic Book Club, who have all been fantastic, I've absolutely loved getting to know all of you better and hearing all of your thoughts. But I would like to know, are you expecting that the Odyssey is going to be a more enjoyable experience because of its focus on a single person and charting kind of their voyage and potentially growth? I don't know if there will be any actual growth in the character or if he'll be largely static and it'll be chronicling the adventures and the fantastical encounters along the way. But it seems like it's a story that would be more palatable to a lot of people because of that focus. So I'm curious to hear, what are your thoughts before we go into it as we are wrapping up the one and knowing what we suspect about the other? Thank you, Shelly. Have a wonderful Christmas, and I look forward to chatting with you more as we go into the new year.